Protesters in Sudan and Algeria have toppled their country's strongmen. But will people power be enough to break the military's grip and push back foreign meddling? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. Millions of people across two of Africa's largest countries are continuing their peaceful protests against the military establishments demanding a transition to civilian rule. In Sudan, protesters vow to remain in the streets until the military hand over the country's political transition to a civilian government. This follows the ouster of President Omar al-Bashir, who spent 30 years in power. Bashir, who's wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, remains behind bars. And in Algeria, mass protests continue, with people calling for the downfall of le pouvoir, or the establishment, weeks after they pushed out the ailing president Abdelaziz Bouteflika, whose rule lasted 2 decades. Several prominent figures around the president, including his brother, have been since arrested. In a few moments, we'll speak with US Ambassador Cameron Hume, who served in both Sudan and Algeria. But first, we go to Khartoum, Sudan, where protesters are still standing firm in their demands.
والحته شكلها اتغير كله.
هاي قالوا داري ينظفوا المكان، قلت لهم انتوا نظفوا الكيزان، نحن بننظف المكان. سقط رجل واحد لم يسقط نظام في الشارع، لانه النظام لسه قاعد، لسه في مؤسسة الدولة، ولسه المجلس العسكري اللي يسلم سلطة مدنية انتقالية، والسلطة المدنية تستلم مهامها حتى نرجع الشارع، ويكون هو ضامن للسلطة المدنية حامليها أو المساعدات الخارجية هي بتساعد في الأزمة الاقتصادية الحاصلة في البلد أصلاً، وفي شح القروش البنوك وكده. لكن طبعاً السعودية والإمارات ما بيعملوا حاجة لله، كده عندهم أجندة ثانية أو داري إلو يد المجلس العسكري أو الحكومة الانتقالية حتى جي.
ضر جدا من إنه أنا قلت رأيي في يوم من الأيام. كان برنامج بتاع اختلاف بتاع رأي، وكان أنا عندي رأي مخالف فيه، بيتكلم عن واقع المرأة السودانية.
طالب بالعدالة والمساواة، طالب بالعدالة والمساواة في الأجور، طالب في العدالة والمساواة إنه أنا بتاع السواري ما يوقفني 2 صباحاً ويقول لي أنت بنت مطلوقة عشان راجع بيتك الساعة 3 صباحاً.
الفيديو اللي عملوه بروموتينج ونزل، الناس اتقبلته بوجهة نظر مختلفة عن غير وجهة النظر اللي أنا كنت قاصداها. ردة فعل المجتمع كانت حاجة كعبة شديد، وكان فيها تهديداتها كانت أقوى شديد من أي تهديدات بتاعت اختلاف رأي. اضطريت أغادر السودان، وبعدها كان جهاز الأمن والمخابرات الوطني السوداني فتح فيني قضية الإلحاد والإشراع العلمانية. هي قضية ما عندها أي شرعية قانونية ولا دستورية، لكن بتاخذ الصدى العاطفي بتاع إنه زول ضد الدين وما بعرف بالشكل ده. فطلعت الطيارة دي لما قالوا إنه خلاص حننزل الخرطوم، أنا في وقتها حسيت إنه هل أنا جازفت مجازفة ما طبيعية؟ صعب جدا أنت تواصل، تفضل قاعد وتشوف إنه أنت حتواصل الثورة دي ورا الشاشة. لأول مرة كان من 6 شهور أحس إنه أنا دخلت نفس حقيقي وطلعت نفس حقيقي. بالنسبة لي البشير ده مجرد وجه لمؤسسة كاملة حكمتنا باسم دين، انتهكت حقوق ناس كثير جدا باسم دين، شوهته أو ما شوهته، هي اختارت إنها تحكم بالطريقة دي. فأنا عايزاها لحد ما تصل لأنها هي دولة مدنية.
اشتغلوني قبل شهر بعنف عنيف، يعني بصورة ما تصورية. بعد ده كنت سعيد يعني، وفي تحدي جوانا، وانا متأكد انه الصدر العاري اقوى من اي دبابة لما يكون هناك اجماع شعبي. دار سودان جميل، مدينة جميلة، داير السلام يتحقق حتى بين الحيوانات، يعني الحمير تكون سعيدة والأقنام والعصافير.
So, high hopes for civilian rule, but also high stakes. Will the military cede control and allow the protesters to define the future of their country? And where does the US and other major powers stand? I'm joined by Cameron Hume, who served as US Chief of Mission to Sudan under President George W. Bush. He was also ambassador to Algeria during the Clinton administration. Ambassador Hume, the new people power movement in Sudan faces a major obstacle, and that is the military. Where does the United States government stand with the people who are demanding civilian rule or with the military that is arguing that the army is the best guarantor for peace and stability?
Well, I think we've made public statements that we want to see change. We welcome the departure of General Bashir, but it's a complicated question.
I don't think you've made too many public statements. In fact, the only innocuous statement came out of the State Department in which it said that the US supports the right of protesters to protest.
I think that your characterization is basically fair. We are not directly involved in sort of a frontline position, either pushing for change or impeding change.
But Ambassador, it's not about being involved or not. It's about making a statement. A huge upheaval going on, extraordinary demonstrations, quite frankly, an overt power grab by the military. Yet the United States government is silent. Nothing, conspicuously absent, not even a tweet.
Well, I think that that's a reality that I've seen too. We would have been far more engaged than we are today.
But while you're absent, your regional allies, the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis, are going right in, pouring billions of dollars into these devastated economies such as Sudan and trying to coerce people and gain control through the military, frankly.
I'm not sure that I'm in a position to say that I know exactly what the Emiratis are doing or the Saudis are doing.
But you know that they've given $3 billion in aid to the Sudanese.
Yes, and inevitably, when you give aid to a country, the money flows through the government, and the government is controlled by the military. Yes.
Yes. So is this an implicit endorsement of the military? The United States keeping quiet about what is going on right now?
No, I would not go that far. I would not. I think it is noteworthy that we seem to be disengaged on what's happening in both Algeria and Sudan, but I cannot read in that that we're trying to tip the scales in one direction or the other.
You don't see it that way. No, could we see, though, a repeat of what happened in Egypt, in Sudan, and perhaps even in Algeria, where the military could regain control despite all of these mass demonstrations?
Okay, I mean, these are three very different countries. Let's leave Algeria to the side. In Sudan, yes, I mean, the military essentially has controlled the government for the past 30 years. And I believe it's, for me at least, it's very hard to foresee a future for Sudan without the military having a key role. Now, they've changed some of their personalities at the top of the military. But if you say, would the military step aside and watch the civilians, none of whom have ever been involved in the government per se, take over the country? I don't see that happening. I don't.
What about Algeria? You just said Algeria obviously is a different case. You know the country very well. For the past 20 years, the United States and France have had a very cozy relationship with Bouteflika. It's an opaque system. The military, we know, has always been the backbone of the regime. But now what's happened is the army chief, Gaid Saleh, has in fact really conducted a power grab. He's concentrating power into his own hands. The army is overtly in charge, and the US again is quiet. Is it because the United States doesn't believe that Algeria is strategically important enough?
Well, I don't think that we've ever given huge strategic importance to Algeria.
Why not?
We have not considered it to be a country in which we have vital interests at stake. We have not put it in the same category as Egypt or Morocco. And why? Actually, when I was ambassador there, I wasn't sure what the differentiation was. But I found when I was serving there that Washington wanted Algeria to become more democratic and peaceful, but it wasn't directly engaged. I would say one thing about Algeria. You must keep in mind that they fought for 8 years to be independent. They lost hundreds of thousands of people. That has changed their character, and that is an experience that no other country in that region had. So they're far more independent-minded than other countries in the region.
And they probably would not react very well to foreign interference. They've had that sort of interference
I wouldn't recommend it.
by the colonial power of France for too many years.
Right.
How important is it beyond Algeria for the United States to step in morally at least and express some kind of support for protests when they do take place? The Saudis are obviously very nervous about what's going on. Is the United States equally nervous?
No, we're not equally nervous because we're a lot further away. But I agree with your premise that it's important when people are wondering what their future is that we represent a perspective of our values and interests. That's different from saying we know the solution for you. I think saying we've looked at your situation and we know the answers you should implement, I think is an error. But it is fair to say that we should say we want you to have an economy which is not controlled by oligarchs connected to the security services. We want you to be able to reduce the level of youth unemployment, particularly among the educated, which is most Americans would not believe that unemployment is worse if you have a university or higher if you have a university degree than if you have no education.
You represented several administrations, including George W. Bush and Clinton. Clearly, the United States administration under President Trump has pinned its hopes, at least its regional policy, on its close alliance with Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and Egypt, Sisi,
Yes.
to counter Iran's influence in the region. Is this, in your opinion, a mistake?
I think we shouldn't be rooting for sides in the Middle East. I think we should be very cautious about that. I often felt when I was serving there and after that while there are people in the United States who understand the Middle East as a political entity, the United States does not understand the Middle East, and we don't perceive the shifting series of alliances among political actors in the Middle East that animate political life there.
Ambassador Cameron Hume, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
And so for decades, the US and other powers have supported authoritarian leaders in North Africa and the Middle East to ensure stability and to protect their own vested interests. But when people are faced with high prices, low wages, massive unemployment, political repression, and corrupt governments, their best option is to take to the streets. But as we learned from 2011, if not handled correctly, they can end up right back where they started, or worse. Katie Fisher takes a look back.
Before 2011, these leaders were standing strong, many for decades. But following the so-called Arab Spring, one by one, they were toppled, brought down by popular revolt. The last two standing were forced out just last month. But instead of the promise of human rights, the end of corruption and economic reform, chaos and war has spread through the region. Tunisia's President Zain El Abidine Ben Ali was the first to be forced out in January 2011 after over 23 years in office. Tunisia inspired revolts across the Middle East and North Africa. And while it has been considered the only success, the country has still endured ISIS attacks and is plagued by high inflation and unemployment, the very issues which brought protesters to the streets in 2010. Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak was forced out in February 2011 shortly after protests erupted in Tahrir Square against his nearly 30-year rule. Mohamed Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, won in the first free election in 2012. But less than a year later, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi led a military overthrow of the democratically elected leader. Sisi was re-elected last year with no serious opposition. And despite a strong police state, last month he further cemented his grip on power with a constitutional amendment that could allow him to rule until 2030. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi was killed in October 2011 after 40 years in power, following an uprising and NATO-led military intervention. Elections were held in 2012, but rebel factions have since turned on each other. Two rival governments now vie for power over the destabilized country. Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh was toppled in February 2012 after nearly a year of protests. The country has since unraveled into a devastating war between Houthi rebels and a Saudi-led coalition. The UN says the death toll is expected to reach 233,000 by the end of this year, as Yemenis struggle with poverty, hunger, and the worst cholera outbreak in the world. And just last month in Algeria, President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's efforts to pursue a fifth presidential term were rejected after a popular uprising. Although they forced him out of office, millions of protesters are still in the streets, demanding a new system of governance and rule of law. And in Sudan, protesters also pushed out Omar al-Bashir after 30 years of rule. They continue to march, demanding a peaceful transition to civilian rule.
So then, will the people be able to wrest control from the military and political leadership? What have we learned from the 2011 uprisings? Joining us now is Thomas Hill. He is a senior program officer for North Africa at the United States Institute of Peace. He's also a former foreign affairs officer at the State Department. Also joining us is Ismail Kushkush, a Sudanese-American journalist and United Nations Foundation reporting fellow at the International Center for Journalists. Welcome to you both. Ismail, to you first. Sudan under Omar al-Bashir survived upheavals, not to mention wars. He himself survived the indictment he faced by the ICC, the secession of what is now South Sudan. What finally brought him down? A protest that began over the price of bread. Was that all it was?
Right. So in 2017, U.S. sanctions were lifted, and there were high hopes that that would improve the economy and the life of Sudanese. That didn't happen. With IMF recommended policies, the prices of basic goods went up. We saw that in 2018. The government started those policies in the outside of Khartoum. And that's when we saw the first protests in the northern city of Atbara. Livelihood in Sudan had reached a point where it was just unbearable for most Sudanese, so the protests spread quickly throughout the country and into the capital.
And as it often does, it morphed into something much bigger than the economic situation and people's aggravations over that. But what really happened behind the scenes? Omar al-Bashir had powerful allies, didn't he, including the Saudis. The US administration was apparently ready to soften its stance against Khartoum. What really happened that led to his ouster? Was it just people power or something else?
Well, I think you have to look at the security apparatus itself in the army. That discontent within the army itself also allied itself with the discontent in the streets with the people. The livelihood, like I said, just reached a point where Sudanese were migrating, leaving the country. The prices of basic goods had tripled. But I think that web of alliances that Bashir had just finally came apart. He had linked himself to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to the war in Yemen. He had historical ties with Qatar. He had the improving relations with the US and, of course, relations with China and the EU and Russia. But that just came apart. That the army itself couldn't take it anymore.
Thomas Hill, important exogenous outside factors in the case of Sudan, but not so different to what we saw in the case of Egypt before that and in the case of Libya, what we're seeing now. In other words, a tough economic situation, the banking system on its knees after decades of sanctions in this case led by the United States, this policy of isolation that seemed to always backfire because the regime stays firmly entrenched, and it is the people, the social, economic fabric that is so badly damaged. In the case of Egypt and Libya as well, aren't we seeing again a continuation of the same failed policies by the United States of keeping strong men in position, either implicitly, tacitly, or with explicit endorsements?
I don't believe the U.S. policy in Libya is backing a particular strongman. The U.S. policy actually has been quite hands-off. Many people would argue to the detriment of the Libyan situation, and that in fact the U.S. has tried very hard to put the UN and the UN process out front, and many would say that that has failed, but I don't think it's the U.S. that's keeping the current system in place in Libya.
No, but it's keeping relatively quiet, isn't it? Just a few days ago, President Trump, in fact, spoke to General Haftar, who has launched this violent offensive on the capital and is trying to overthrow the government there. And in a White House statement, this is what he says, quote, that he recognized Haftar's significant role in fighting terrorism and securing Libya's oil resources. And he talked about the shared vision for Libya's transition to a stable democratic political system. Is this the US admitting once again that it will support dictators as long as they bend to its will and also protect its vested interests?
I don't think so. I don't think the U.S. Has a standard practice of backing dictators. And I can't speak to the president's phone call with General Hiftar, but publicly the policy remains only a political solution in Libya is appropriate. And that seems to be the same policy that the U.S. and its allies want to push. But there are others that don't share that vision.
Do you agree, no policy of backing dictators?
At the moment, in the case of Sudan, I think the U.S. has been careful that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are the countries that seem to be taking the lead on whatever policy the international community takes on Sudan. But I think people on the streets do want to see a stronger voice coming out from the U.S. and from the international committee on transition into civilian government in Sudan.
Thomas Hill, if we look at what's going on in Algeria, massive, unprecedented demonstrations, 20 million people perhaps coming out onto the streets every Friday for the 11th successive Friday, asking for real change, for the system to be brought down, for military rule to end, and for a proper transfer of power to a civilian-led government. This is half the population, 20 million people, and yet not a word from the US administration. What are we to make from that silence?
Well, I think the Algerians have been pretty clear that they want this to be an Algerian-led process and don't appreciate the influence of outside actors, to include U.S. I think there could be a healthy debate about whether or not the U.S. should rhetorically support what's happening, but from a policy perspective, it seems very clear that nobody in Algeria is clamoring for the U.S. to take a position and stand out strong on this.
No, they may not be, but certainly the U.S. is a superpower, and many people are watching to see what the U.S. has to say. From a strategic U.S. and European perspective, Ismail, how important is it what goes on in countries like Sudan and Algeria, two of the three largest countries in Africa, and how important is it to the rest of the continent in spurring movements that could be quite similar?
Right. So the U.S. has and the EU have a number of interests in these North African countries. In the case of Sudan, it seems that the U.S. has been mostly concerned with issues of security, not seeing Sudan turn into another Libya or Yemen. With the EU, the question of migration, Sudan being one of the major transit countries for refugees and migrants going to Europe. So that is the kind of relationship that these governments had with the Bashir government, and they want to make sure that whatever comes in the future maintains that same type of relationship.
Thomas Hill, authoritarian rule, and we speak about this quite often, is justified in so many of these different countries by the specter of Islamists taking over power. We saw this in Egypt with Sisi thwarting the so-called revolution there and taking over control. He managed a few days ago to get President Trump to list the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. To what extent do you see this as wise and sound US policy to be backing, emboldening these sort of authoritarian rulers instead of people who are asking for democracy?
Well, I think it would be imprudent to try and say globally we will have one policy. The idea is that we have interests that are different in different parts of the world. And while the Egypt policy, in my mind, is not clearly articulated, I don't know at this point what actions the U.S. could take that would change the outcome.
Ismail, we mentioned earlier the Emiratis and the Saudis on the one hand. There's also Qatar and Turkey on the other.
Right.
Can anything good come out of all of this if you have the strong footprint of any of these regional powers waging their own proxy wars?
I think protesters on the ground in Sudan and also in Algeria want to see that they take control of their affairs without the interference of regional powers, whether it be these two major axes, the UAE-Saudi axis on one hand, and Egypt, particularly in the case of Sudan, Egypt having particular historical relations with Sudan, or Qatar and Turkey on the other side. There have been people have been chanting, no interference from the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Egypt in Khartoum. and even have called to refuse the aid package that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have sent to Sudan. So they don't want to see Sudan turn into another Egypt or into another Libya, that they want to see a true transition into a democratic government.
Thomas Hill, very briefly, the role of these regional powers is quite obvious. What about the role of the larger powers, not just the United States, but China and Russia as well? Sudan and Algeria both have oil and gas.
Yeah, well, I would like to believe that great powers have more than a singular interest in these countries beyond energy, and certainly the will of the people should be respected in a democratic process that's inclusive, but great powers should refrain from trying to tip the scales in one direction or another.
Thomas Hill, Ismail Kushkush, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so while it is always worrisome when major powers interfere in the internal affairs of developing countries, it is equally worrisome when they remain conspicuously silent in the face of massive popular upheavals demanding an end to authoritarian rule. In the end, will the people be able to defeat the powerful forces pulling the strings, both domestic and foreign? And will they be able to have the final say? From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.